to the Web3 Prof Podcast.
Good morning and good afternoon, everybody. I'm here with Daniel Batten, who in my view is the global leader in understanding the environmental impacts of Bitcoin mining and also the founder of CH4 Capital. Daniel, thanks so much for being with me here today.
Great to be here.
First thing I'd like to just get an understanding of is, what is your history in Bitcoin? How did you get into this? What do people refer to as a rabbit hole?
Well, it came from asking a dangerous question about 3 years ago when I was running Climate Tech Fund, and I asked the question, how much impact are we having? And the answer was, well, really not as much as we would like to, because we were investing in companies which were only mitigating carbon dioxide. We were doing nothing for methane, which the UN said was an even more urgent problem. We were investing in high-risk technologies, but we weren't investigating technologies that existed today. And we were investing in technologies that would only have an impact after 2035. So I thought, well, what if we turn this around and invest in methane mitigation today using low-risk existing technology that's going to have a pre-2035 impact? And that led me on a path when I realized landfills were a huge source of methane emissions. And I realized from there that for a lot of the landfills in the world, the best thing to do with it is to turn that methane into electricity using generators on site, and then to sell that to the grid. But the problem is, for a lot of the world's landfills, you can't sell it to the grid either. Regulations prevent it, such as the country I'm in, which is Costa Rica, or it's too far from the grid, or it needs a major substation upgrade to be able to take that power. So for those landfills, it's completely stranded energy, so you need a customer on site. And it turns out there's really no customer in the world who's prepared to invest all that extra capital in the form of gas capture and collection and generators unless they have a very substantial portion of their operating costs coming from power. And Bitcoin mining is really the only type of user of energy that economic equation makes sense for. So that became the solution, and that got me just fascinated in the question of where else can Bitcoin have positive environmental benefits.
What's your background that this was even a road that you were willing to go down? How did you even get into understanding, methane and garbage?
It's an interesting question. I think if it hadn't been for the pandemic, I probably wouldn't have. What had happened earlier is that had really prepared me in the benefits of doing your own research, because I wanted to make an informed decision about whether I took the vaccine or not. And I suspected that I was hearing mad conspiracy theories on one side, but I wasn't convinced with the government narrative either. And so I thought, well, I'm just going to go from first principles and do my own research. And I did that, and that led me to the conclusion that, this is a disease, or this is an illness which is a respiratory illness, which vaccines aren't traditionally very good at coping with because it mutates very fast. So it's not a choice of having one vaccine, it's a choice of having probably one every year, like the flu jab. And also, it seems to me like this is a disease which is mainly, based on the statistics I was reading, affects people who are 70 years plus and have a whole lot of comorbidities. Well, I'm not 70 years plus and I don't have comorbidities. I'm pretty healthy. And it strikes me that there's not a lot of emphasis being placed on raising the immune system. It seems like we're defaulting to a pharmaceutical approach. I'm going to sit this one out and not take the vaccine. And some months later and then some years later, that research was shown to be sound despite a lot of the conventional wisdom of the time, whereas at the time it was called man and conspiratorial. So that really prepared me to trust my own research, my ability to put other viewpoints to one side and really listen to the signal, not the noise, but also to go to first principles. And so when I had people from either side, one side telling me Bitcoin's great for the environment, another side telling me it's terrible for the environment, I did the same thing, put both voices to one side and looked at first principles and thought, right, let's get my own answer on this based on the research, based on how this technology seems to be trending. And that was a very different conclusion, again, to what the mainstream wisdom was at the time. Although, once again, as with COVID, now the world's kind of catching up. And even recently, Cambridge came out and said, yeah, actually, Bitcoin is 54% sustainable energy based. We got our e-waste calculations wrong by a factor of is only 7% of what the original research thought it was. It's mitigating methane, it's stabilizing grids at scale. It's a very different picture to what people believed. And some people still believe based on what they read in the media several years ago.
That's remarkable. Are you the typical Bitcoiner in the sense like libertarian, maybe right-wing, understanding these types of political and economic perspectives?
Well, I am a long-time environmental activist. I'm vegan. I meditate and do breathing techniques. And I came to Bitcoin mining before I had any interest whatsoever in sound money. So I think the only thing that's typical about me is that I like to do my own research.
That's great. I find that quite inspirational because there is often kind of this almost like singular target segment of who Bitcoiners are. And I appreciate learning about, people who have maybe other viewpoints on other topics that might not align with like what the world think Bitcoiners are.
And you know what? I think that's who maybe an archetype of someone on Bitcoin Twitter might be, but I don't think that's representative of who people who hold Bitcoin are. I think if you look at the research there, you have a much, much wider spread right across the political spectrums. And also you have a lot of regional variation where maybe that's more true in the States, but certainly it's not the case in Europe. And it's definitely not the case in places like Nigeria, which has one of the highest Bitcoin adoption rates in the world, where people have really been driven at, in fact, probably of anything, they're mainly at the political left because there's a lot of political activists who are using it to fight authoritarian regimes. So I think it has a real spread, and we have to be mindful that the ones who are most vocal, I mean, I was at the Bitcoin conference recently, and, we had, high representation from the Republican Party and little to no representation from any other party. And we have to be careful that the whole Bitcoin movement doesn't become neuro-associated with any particular political persuasion, because that's what happened with the climate movement. It became very heavily, it used to be very apolitical. In fact, one of the very first global leaders who spoke openly about climate change was a conservative leader from the UK, Margaret Thatcher, who spoke at length about the importance of investing in counteracting climate change. And we kind of forget that. And then in the 90s and early 2000s, it really started to heavily align with the left. And I think that was a real mistake, that somehow we lost that bipartisan, nonpartisan approach. And so we have to be very careful that doesn't happen with Bitcoin as well, because, again, this is something that benefits everyone. It's an apolitical technology.
I think that's really powerful. And I think there's also really important aspects of Bitcoin that really help the marginalized people in society. And that is typically a value of the left. But I think Bitcoin is often, and sometimes I think because of politicians, right? Like if Donald Trump supports Bitcoin, it must be a right-wing thing. Thus, if I'm left-wing, I can't support it because now it's seen as a right-wing thing. And I think you're right. This is probably what we see a lot in the United States, but I really appreciate that, Bitcoin doesn't care what your political views are, right? It is absolutely neutral.
It really doesn't. I mean, if you look at the early adopters of the internet, they were not typical of the people who use the internet today. So thank heavens, a lot of them are anarchists and a lot of socialists. And yet the people who use the internet today is just spread across the whole population. So that's a future I see for Bitcoin. But in the meantime, we have some just interesting, I think, beliefs or perceptions to form and to reform. And I think that in the Bitcoin community, we're equally responsible for that and making sure that it's presented in a way which really welcomes anyone based on how people want to use it and be involved with it, because it's a technology that, just like the internet, it can support your values. It's about how you use it.
That's great. Daniel, how do you respond to those who criticize Bitcoin, kind of going back to one of our earlier points here, that the energy use is bad for the environment? And how do we also relate this to other industries? And I mean, AI is the thing that we talk about, relative to other industries, like how bad, quote unquote, is Bitcoin for the environment?
I turn it around the other way, and I'd say, how good is it for the environment? Because I don't believe that it is going to be negative to humanity at all. So my background is as a climate tech investor, and as such, every single technology that I've ever invested in has a carbon footprint to start with, because it has to, because the utility of the technology comes later. Just like the profits come later, so does the utility. And so there's this period where you're basically sinking money into a company, you're not getting a return. There's also a period where it's creating carbon emissions, but it's not mitigating them. And this was the same for solar. In fact, that took 57 years to pay off its carbon debt. It was the same with wind technology, same with battery technology, same with direct air capture. In fact, that's been around for about 20 years, and it still is nowhere near paying off its carbon debt. It's creating massively more emissions than it's abating. But we keep investing in it. Why? Because we believe at some point that'll trend reverse and we'll start going towards carbon neutral and then carbon negative. And so with Bitcoin, it's the same. It's not enough. It's a very unsophisticated and frankly naive assessment to look at a technology and say, well, it creates emissions, therefore it's bad for the environment. Again, we would have concluded solar energy was bad for the environment if we'd had that rubric. So what we have to do is we have to say, well, of course it has emissions. All technology will have emissions to start with. That's kind of called so what. Now let's look at what its positive environmental externalities are, and let's look at how long it might take until some of those start to kick in. And in the case of Bitcoin, they're kicking in right now in terms of mitigating methane. So for example, Bitcoin's one of the few technologies that can use pollution as a fuel source. In other words, you can use methane that's leaking into the environment from landfills or oil fields, divert it to a generator, convert it to electricity, locate your Bitcoin mining rig on site and use that electricity. And some people say, well, you can do that with anything. Well, you can, but that's not the point. You can't do it profitably. And so unless you can do it profitably, it's not going to happen, which is why it didn't happen for many, many years. Bitcoin can do it profitably without an economic subsidy. So that's why it's been extraordinarily and recognized by Cambridge recently for mitigating megatons of methane, of rather carbon dioxide equivalent emissions every single year. In fact, 3 million megatons is phenomenal. And then you look at other features such as, yes, because it's a flexible user of energy, it has the ability to counterbalance the intermittency of renewable energy. It has the ability to locate on a solar farm or on a wind farm and be a customer for that energy before it interconnects to the grid, which means that solar farm or wind farm can become more profitable. And what do they do with that profit? The same as any business owner does. They plow it back into expanding their business operation, which in their case is more solar or more wind. So it has a number of tremendous benefits. I was speaking to a guy recently who was actually a nuclear safety engineer from Japan. He worked on coordinating the American and the Japanese response teams in the Fukushima nuclear power plant after the tsunami and after the meltdown. And the reason that he got into Bitcoin was what happened afterwards was Japan went from 56 nuclear power plants down to 14. So it had to very rapidly do two things. One, it imported a lot of fossil fuel. And secondly, it urgently set up new wind farms and solar farms. But then it got into the problems that anyone gets into when you have a lot of wind or solar on the grid suddenly, which is that it's a variable power source. So the grid operator has to constantly match supply and demand even more difficultly, because not only is demand changing, but now the supply is also changing. Whereas at least with nuclear or fossil fuels, they would know at any one point in time how much supply they would have. They don't with renewable. So it becomes twice as difficult to keep the grid balanced, to the point where he said, look, without Bitcoin mining, we can only really go up to 50% solar and wind. But with Bitcoin mining, we can go right up to 70%. And this is someone who was not a Bitcoiner. He simply used it as a tool to investigate how it could create a higher proliferation of solar and wind power on the grid.
That's absolutely remarkable. When we look at the sustainable energy sources for Bitcoin mining, how do we know, or in this case, maybe how does Cambridge know how many or how much energy is supplied to the Bitcoin network by sustainable sources?
Well, no one knows for sure, because we don't know where every Bitcoin mining company in the world is operating. So we have to do the next best thing, and that is we have to use models. And we've got a couple of models. We have one from the Digital Assets Research Institute that says that the percentage is around 56.7. I think their last estimate was. Cambridge is slightly more conservative, 52.4. But they're all, the Bitcoin Mining Institute, which is an industry body, a little bit higher, 59%, but they're all in the 50s. And so we're getting a consistent message here, which is saying that, yes, it's trended towards predominantly sustainable energy. The Cambridge model is fairly conservative as well, because there's a lot of off-grid mining, which Cambridge has not surveyed. And what happens with Bitcoin mining is, so they've got it's a survey which was created, went through quite a rigorous academic process, where that mainly with the larger Bitcoin mining companies. But what we know is a lot of the smaller companies are mining using off-grid power. And when you're using off-grid, they're using off-grid because it's cheaper. And so that'll be stranded energy, that'll be wasted energy. And most of the time, stranded or wasted energy tends to be renewable. Not always, but in about 80% of the case, it'll be more cheap than the fossil fuel equivalent. So a lot of that isn't represented in the Cambridge survey. So we suspect that once you do add that in, then you actually get a higher number. But Cambridge is a reputable name, and they used to have the best survey. Then it lost tune for about 3 years. So this is actually well out of date. They've really just caught up to what they know to have been the case, and people in the Bitcoin mining industry have known to be the case for some time. It's just that it took a long time for Cambridge, a reputable, independent academic body, to come up with their latest survey, which took about a year to prepare. And yeah, now this is what we know the baseline is at least 52%, which pretty much reflects what the industry has been saying for some time.
Oh, that's great. What recent developments do you see in Bitcoin mining, like similar to the shift that we've seen in energy use towards stranded energy? What is being underreported, or what is being misrepresented or misunderstood right now related to Bitcoin mining?
I think generally speaking, it's not so much what's been misreported, it's what is not been reported at all. And unfortunately, this Cambridge report has not been reported at all in the mainstream media. Now, when it was saying that Bitcoin was only 37% sustainable and mostly fossil fuels, then, yeah, every newspaper in the UK was running that article. When there was a 5-page commentary, basically an op-ed, non-empirical research, using what we now know was falsified or at least non-representative in the best case scenario data, the BBC and a whole bunch of media outlets reported that when that data was saying, hey, Bitcoin's using too much water, or it was creating too much e-waste. So I think this is just part of a phenomenon. We shouldn't be surprised by this. We've known for some time, it's not new, that negative headlines tend to sell better than positive ones. So Bitcoin uses a swimming pool of water per transaction, which of course was nonsense. Makes a really good headline, whereas Bitcoin uses 52% sustainable energy. It's kind of boring for people to read, so it just doesn't tend to get reported as much. So it's more that the issue is not so much that things are getting misreported now. The mainstream media actually are a lot better than they were, in that they're not reporting anything, which is a lot better than what they were doing, which was only picking up the sensationalist studies and amplifying them, whilst ignoring all the peer-reviewed ones that were showing the opposite was true. So things have improved, but unfortunately for about a 4-year period of time between 2018 and 2022, there was a huge volume of what we now know was just junk science that was reported. And we know it's junk science because now it's been debunked in peer-reviewed journals, in some cases multiple times. But that was reported a lot in the media. And so the people who read that, who are now not getting the reporting on the accurate case, the latest Cambridge report, that's what a lot of people still believe. So there is a legacy, whilst even though the media reporting has improved, it's kind of like the way I say it is, we've stopped pouring poison in the top of the river, but doesn't mean that everyone who drank from that river is suddenly healed. So there's a lot of work to do.
I like that. I mean, I've heard a lot of people say about the study from University of Hawaii, I think it was, that really got a lot of legs when we all believe that Bitcoin used as much energy as the country of, I don't even know what it was. Was that a common study that people were referencing?
I think the one you were referring to, that was one of the early ones, Mora et al., where they were trying to create a link between Bitcoin and climate change, and
That's right.
as well as making a unit error where they multiplied things by 1,000 times too much in their calculations that went all the way through to the peer-reviewed journal. They also didn't realize there was such a thing as a difficulty adjustment in Bitcoin, which also skewed their results. So it was... honestly, the standard of peer-reviewed study on Bitcoin in the early days was abominable. And that's often the case with new technologies, because that's where the peer review process tends to break down, because it's the blind leading the blind. You're having people who are writing academic articles about Bitcoin, and unfortunately, because very few people understand it, and there seems to be this prejudice against consulting people, the very people who would understand it within industry, who could say, no, that's not how it works. There's this thing called the difficulty adjustment. But if you don't consult those people, then you'll just have the blind leading the blind, and you'll have junk science that makes its way all the way through into, in some cases, some quite erudite journals. Then as people start to understand it more, that happens less and less. And this has been the case with a lot of technologies. It's the same with Bitcoin as well.
Yeah. Can you explain, and maybe especially to those who are newer to understanding Bitcoin mining, how Bitcoin mining can actually help renewable energy adoption, in particular in places or regions which are energy abundant and maybe underdeveloped in that way?
So what tends to happen is, because of the way that government subsidies have worked with renewable energy, you've had an incentive to build renewable generation. You did not have an incentive to make sure that that generation was being used by people. So as a result, if someone gives you a big wad of money and says, hey, we'll give you this huge subsidy to build renewable generation, and that's larger than the money you get from actually selling the power, then what are you going to do? You're just going to look for the cheapest land where you can take the money, right? Which is exactly what happened. So where's the cheapest land? Well, it's where no people live. Okay, so you build all this renewable and solar capacity and wind capacity where no one lives. Great. Now, unlike the world where we're communicating now without wires, our electricity grid is a wired world. So if you don't have wires to be able to transport that energy, those electrons from where it's generated to where it's consumed, you're out of luck. It's like you get congestion. You have about 15 trucks you want to suddenly drive all at once in parallel every 5 minutes, or let's say every 15 seconds down a single lane cycle path. It's not going to work. And that's kind of what's happened, where we've got these very constrained grids, which are very aging, and in some cases just don't have the capacity to transport all that power down. So it gets congested, just like roads get congested. If suddenly you build, I mean, this happens all the time, right? You put up new condos, new apartments, new supermarkets, you build a new suburb, and then suddenly everyone gets surprised that we have a congestion problem on our highways.
Right.
Same thing happens with the transmission of energy. So you've got a whole lot of congestion, and a lot of that electricity is not reaching people. And this happened in Texas, happens around the world, happened in Northern Territory of Australia, in Greece, Scotland versus transporting power down to the south in England, the north of Germany, transporting power down to the south of Germany where industry is. Always solar and wind, and always the same problem, that a lot of it got curtailed and wasted because it couldn't transport effectively over the grid. And the grid upgrade was going to cost billions, and it would have also resulted in, you would have had to ask permission of a lot of people, and in some cases the regulations just prevented it. So it just got wasted. And because it got wasted, then what happened was that then you had a backlash from the fossil fuel lobby group saying, look at all this wasted renewable energy. It's putting power prices up, because when we can't use that energy, we have to use gas and coal anyway. We might as well just have more coal and gas. And they kind of had a point, but they were not completely correct, because the problem wasn't renewable energy. The problem was government policies that had incentivized the building of renewable energies in places where it's never going to be able to be delivered. So Bitcoin's performed a little bit of a rescue mission on two fronts. Number one, it's been able to go and co-locate on those solar farms that were really just white elephants in many, many cases, or wind farms, and make them profitable where they weren't. That's the first thing it's been able to do, particularly as the government subsidies came off, which means they've been able to expand again and make more sensible decisions about where they expand. But the second thing it's been able to do, it's been able to prevent that backlash against the renewable energy industry as a whole. Like in West Texas, for example, the same thing started to happen, where you got this massive proliferation of wind and solar in West Texas, where the land was cheap and there was a lot of sun, a lot of wind, but all the people lived in East Texas, and same thing, you couldn't transport that power. So Bitcoin mining units set up in West Texas used that power, which made the solar and wind operators more profitable and allowed them to basically continue to build out their solar and wind operations. And we've seen, since Bitcoin mining took hold in Texas in 2021, after a lot of them were kicked out of China, not all, but some of them, then a lot of them came to Texas, either directly or via Kazakhstan. Then they got kicked out of there too, and then came to Texas. So a lot of them found their way up there. And what it's enabled is that from 2021 to 2025, we've gone from 80 gigawatts up to 140 gigawatts of renewable energy generation, which is extraordinary, because it was starting to get to a point where it was tapering off. You were getting those backlashes. People were saying it's not being utilized. And whilst it's true that renewable energy is the cheapest form of energy, that's only true if people are using it. If people are not able to use it, it's actually really expensive and it can put power prices up. And that's what causes backlashes. So you have the political right tend to care more these days about energy security, and the political left tend to care more about sustainability. And we have this battle where we go through these cycles where you get one but not the other. But of course, we need both together. And so Bitcoin is a technological solution where what the left and the right care about can be met together. But you can't do it just by sitting together and singing Kumbaya. You actually need a technology that can meet the aims of each party. And Bitcoin has been a method to be able to do this very effectively, more effective. Other things can help, battery, pumped hydro, all these things can help. But Bitcoin, for a number of different reasons, is, I would say, more effective than any of these other technologies.
One thing at the beginning of the podcast, you had mentioned, when I asked you if you're effectively, are you a liberal or conservative? And you said you're a vegan and you are involved in breath work and meditation. How do those things play into your life?
Well, it's in one breath, I'll say, it's what allows me to counteract a lot of misinformation about Bitcoin and Bitcoin mining and stay empathetic with people and not lose my rag. Because frankly, a lot of the arguments that I come across have been debunked a long time ago. It's the same things that people say, but that doesn't mean, look, for that person who's saying it, it's not the first time they've said it. So meditation and breathwork is something that's allowed me to have a clearer mind, to be able to, I think, do the research more effectively, to communicate the results of that research more effectively, and to stay in empathy with people when people have a different opinion or viewpoint to what they're hearing me say. So it's been absolutely critical throughout this entire journey.
What does it actually look like for you? Are you like just getting up in the morning and rolling on a yoga mat in the tropics of Costa Rica?
Pretty much, yeah. I mean, the yoga mat tends to not even need rolling out. It's a permanent fixture. But pretty much, yeah, it looks like I do back in the day, I think a lot of people attempt to go straight into meditation, find that all that's happening is they've got their eyes closed and they're just thinking about work, and they think, this is ridiculous, I might as well just be doing work. And the problem is that you're not wrong. If that is all that's happening, then yeah, it's not going to be doing a great deal, but just trying to meditate on an app by itself, that's hard. That's a hard way to start. And this is a time where we need to kind of go back to some ancient wisdom because we have this predilection to think that the newest is always the best. And when it comes to technology, that's generally true. A new Bitcoin mining rig is going to be more effective than an old one, right? A new microphone will be better than an old one. A new computer will outperform an older computer. But that's not true of knowledge. Knowledge is universal and eternal. And so sometimes it gets lost. It gets compartmentalized, and we forget things that we used to know were true. And so one example is it was known for a long time that if you wanted to, I'll give you an example. So we have like some crazy depression statistics at the moment, just off the charts, and it's increasing. And back in the day, before you had Prozac and before you had, again, pharmaceutical solutions to these things, what did people do when someone was feeling down and when someone felt overwhelmed with problems? They would say, go look at the stars. Okay, now, why would they say that? Well, for one thing, there wasn't so much light pollution, so it was easier to do that. And they'd just lay down, they'd look at the stars. And the moment you look at the stars, what happens is you realize that you're part of something much bigger than you. And then this perspective shift happens where those problems that you thought were very big are held relative to the enormity of time and space, and you realize actually they're very small. And the moment that happens, there's this relief that happens from the problem. And it was a very effective technique. The second thing they used to do is they would say, well, generally speaking, you feel depressed, you feel down, you feel low when you're not feeling useful. Because the best way to affirm your worth is through action. And if you're not getting the opportunity to affirm that worth through action, through service, then, yeah, that could result in you feeling down. And so they'd make sure the person was getting out there and doing some service for the community. Didn't have a depression problem. And the other thing they'd do is they'd say, well, do something for your mind. We do dental hygiene every day, twice a day. But what about mental hygiene? So what are we doing for mental hygiene? You know, we walk around without cleaning our mind, without clearing it of clutter. Maybe in the future people will have a mental pollution tax. But so what are we doing to declutter our own mind? The answer for the most part is very little. And so, again, people knew that it was very important. If you wanted to have clear speech, you needed to have a clear mind. If you wanted to have clear actions, you needed clear thoughts. And how do you get clear thoughts? Well, three things were important. First one was they recognized that particularly if you're doing a lot of thinking, restlessness builds up in the physical body. So some form of exercise is important. And they would have a sequence of yoga asanas which were designed to remove, not just to limber up and to become fit and to become supple, but would actually to relieve and release restlessness from the body. And if you don't do that first, then, yeah, you can sit down and meditate, but you'll still have that restlessness in the system. So I always start with some yoga stretches. And then before you go into meditation, there's a bridge. What is it that bridges the body to the mind? Well, the literal bridge is your breath, because it's literally connecting the inner world and the outer world. You take the breath from the outer world and it becomes part of your inner world. And so the breath is linking your body to your mind and helps you to go into a deeper state where through different breathing rhythms, of course, their effects are pronounced and profound on the mind, on the clarity of thought, on the ability to release stresses and release toxins from the body. So much has been written about it in various breath techniques, whether it's Wim Hof or holotrophic breath work or sky breathing, Sudarshan Kriya, which is what I do. But the other effect of the breathing technique is not just the mental and the physical benefit, it's preparing you to go into a deeper state of meditation. And then, so that's the second thing. And the third thing, sit down and meditate. Now, that kind of feels like a lot for a lot of people. And so my recommendation is, number one, you don't learn from an app. You know, do a proper course, do an Art of Living course, learn the proper breathing technique. Start with the breath. And that'll make it much easier to go into deeper meditation afterwards.
I think that's interesting. I live in Vancouver, and we're the home of Lululemon, which is, I guess, maybe been a positive impact on popularizing yoga around the world, and it's a big thing here. And I also live by the ocean, and Daniel, I have a 10-year-old daughter who's got a pretty significant physical disability. She's had 24 surgeries in the last 10 years.
Wow.
And the amount of stress that, my wife and I carry around this is obviously pretty significant. It can be overwhelming. And I've found that one of the most impactful ways for me to kind of deal with some of these challenges that you're clearly identifying was to get into the ocean in the winter and to get cold. And those kind of like hyper-focused moments when it's only a couple degrees outside and the ocean is freezing cold, it doesn't really allow you to think about anything other than that moment, the pain that you're going through and dealing with the cold exposure, right?
Yeah, you're in Vancouver. I don't imagine the oceans are particularly warm in the winter. So that'll bring you into the moment pretty fast. Yeah, look, I mean, there's numerous techniques. And again, the ancient ones would always know this. And yeah, cold immersion is one of them. Wim Hof talks a lot about cold immersion and the numerous physiological benefits that it has as well. But one of them is simply for the mind, bringing you sharply into the present moment. Dance, singing, all these things will bring the mind fully into the present moment. And why is that so important? Because life's racing by. There's so many opportunities to go into the future. Oh, what's Bitcoin doing today? What's it doing tomorrow? What will it do in 5 years? What's my goals? Am I providing enough for my family? Blah, blah, blah. And it's great to have goals. And know that goal is not going to give you any great lasting happiness. Maybe at best it'll give you like 2 weeks, when you have, but again, is that happiness coming from the realization of the goal? Or is that just coming from the relief of not having a goal? If you can be happy in this present moment and just fully appreciate everything, and the children do this naturally, it's not some superhuman state, it's just that we've become conditioned to looking ahead. It starts with school, we look ahead to the next grade, to the next class, to what our siblings are doing, to what people older than us are doing, then university or whatever it is, then some job. Then when you get married, and then when you have children, and then when they've left home, and when you have grandchildren, or when you retire. And so we're continually kind of looking ahead to some future moment, which we think is going to deliver us happiness. But in the meantime, the present moment, time's running so fast like a river, and we're not here and we're not alert. So those cold immersions, that time when you're fully present, that's where all the joy is. That's the only place the joy is. You can't experience joy in the future. You can only experience it in the present moment. I mean, it's true by definition, but we forget that, huh?
Yeah.
So have goals, absolutely. Have dreams, have plans. And then the moment you've had them, come right back and focus on, right, don't expect to be happy when I achieve that goal. What can I do to be happy right now? So that the person who arrives there has already been practicing being happy for the last 5 years. I mean, Aristotle once said we become what we habitually do. So if our strategy to achieve some goal that we think is going to make us happy is to struggle and stress and grind, well, what have we practiced? We've practiced being someone who's unhappy and grinding and stressing and is very, very good at deferring pleasure and happiness for some future path. So we get to our goal, we've become that person, which is why so many entrepreneurs in particular, this is the affliction where you have the great exit and everyone thinks, great, you'll be happy now. But what do? They either start up another company because that's all they know how to do using the same recipe. But and realize, I've been a fool. I've deferred. My children have grown up and I haven't been present with them. And that's not years that I can suddenly just take back. And in the meantime, I've become some person who I can't suddenly rapidly unbecome.
One thing, there's kind of like this external idea that, people who are into Bitcoin are just in it for the speculation, for the number go up, for getting rich, maybe even getting rich quick. And one thing that I've always found to be most encouraging to be involved in the Bitcoin community is kind of the positive social impact that Bitcoin can bring. And I think when we talk about meditation and breath work and doing yoga and, all of these type of things, I think I think some of that's so necessary because there's just so many problems and negativity that we're dealing with. If we can also understand we're involved in a community that's legitimately changing lives for the positive. It also makes our days, I think, just so much more palatable or exciting. how do you see, or what do you see, or maybe even have stories about like how Bitcoin is maybe relieving poverty, or how it's impacting refugees, or allowing women in marginalized countries to participate in the economy? Like where do we see Bitcoin having a positive social impact?
Yeah, I think that's right. There's a phrase which is, I came for the number, go up. I stayed for the revolution. And another phrase which is that Bitcoin is not a get-rich-quick scheme. It's a avoid going poor slowly scheme.
Yeah, that's great.
And one thing that I've definitely noticed is the sense, one thing that I really enjoy is as I said, it's a very diverse community. In fact, there's no such thing as the Bitcoin community, really. It's like saying the internet using community. It's so diverse. But there is one thing, particularly for the people who are very actively involved in helping to accelerate Bitcoin adoption, brings us all together, and that's a sense of being part of something which is bigger than you, being part of a movement that's bigger than you. And that's what I find really rewarding. And for me, again, people have different ways that they want to express that. But for me, it's always been about, how does it impact people for the better? And the way people use Bitcoin in the West is completely different to how people use it in the global South. There's this debate that comes up from time to time, which is Bitcoin, or should it be first a store of value and then a medium of exchange? And I just find it fascinating to see how the one assumption behind all of that discussion is that we're only talking about the West.
Right.
But if you go outside of the West, if you go into countries like Nigeria, for example, they're not using it as a store of value. They're using it as a medium of exchange. They're using it as a way to avoid bank accounts being frozen if they protest against death squads. They're using it to get remittances across borders without being charged 15% fees or more. They're using it as a tool to prevent currency debasement. And some people say, well, couldn't they use stable coins? Well, the answer is actually stable coins have certain features which mean it's not so suitable. For example, you still have a CEO that can be pressured into various actions. Mm-hmm. You still have a SWIFT network. If you don't have a SWIFT network, forget it. If you have a decentralized network which isn't dependent on any other financial rails that can be intervened, then that's really what you want in an authoritarian country. And that's been critical. That's been a lifeline for many, many people. The guy who I co-write my newsletter with was interesting. He said, well, I used to use stable coins. He had a different reason for changing to Bitcoin. And he said, but we worked out the best way for me to be able to pay him for his efforts on my newsletter was to pay him in Bitcoin using the Lightning Network. And he said, as soon as he started doing that, he never went back to stable coins. And the reason was, he said, well, what I get paid in Bitcoin, I keep in Bitcoin. And so for him, it's a tool of accumulation. And he had such a big smile on his face when he said that too, because it was like, no, he's contributing to something which is, going to be there for him in the future. So however small, it's providing something which is a possible escape route or a possible source of improving circumstances. So I think the ways it's used outside the West are radically different. And part of my research recently has been focused on, well, what about people who are refugees? People who are fleeing war-torn countries or natural disasters or political unrest, or they're political dissidents. They're seeking asylum and they're going from one country to another. And what got me curious was a single newspaper article about a man who had left Ukraine in 2022, and he had a thumb drive, and on the thumb drive he had $2,000 worth of Bitcoin on it. And he wasn't able to take $2,000 out of an ATM. They had, I think, $20 limits, and they had 12-hour queues to get that much. He wouldn't have been able to take gold out of the country. Good luck taking gold across the border and still having it when you arrive. But he was able to take Bitcoin out of the country. And with that Bitcoin, he was able to reestablish a life. I mean, I think he went to Poland, and he was able to reestablish a life there. And I thought, I wonder how many other people who are in this category. You're not going to hear from them firsthand because for the most part, they don't want to be identified. It wasn't his real name on the report because last thing they want is scrutiny about when there's maybe 10,000 other refugees come with you, that there's one person who has Bitcoin. That's on a need-to-know basis. And I just thought, well, surely we can quantify that. So part of my research, and I'm grateful to have had some assistance from the Human Rights Foundation to start to quantify some of these things. How many people does this impact? And it's early on, but the provisional data is showing that there's over 100,000 people around the world in this category already who, because they've held some amount of Bitcoin, have been able to reestablish their life as refugees. Because if we look at the Bitcoin ownership rates, we look at the demographics of people who are fleeing, and we look at whether they're more likely or less likely to hold Bitcoin. In some cases, none of them will because there's too much poverty. And in other cases, if it's political distance, there'll be a higher amount to do. We even those things out. And we look at the amount of refugees from different countries and where they're migrating to and from. We subtract the ones who are still in refugee camps. Yeah, we get to over 100,000 people around the world already who have benefited from this technology. So again, they're not using it the same way people use it in the West. And in a sense, yes, you could say that is a store of value, but it's a store of value which has a very different meaning than it would to someone using it as a store of value in the West.
I mean, at that point, it's a store of value and a tool of survival, right?
Exactly.
Like without this, like I'm not making it to the next country and I won't survive.
Yeah, or you will make it there, but then you'll be dependent on handouts to get started from scratch rather than having your own financial autonomy from scratch. And it's just it's a very different starting point.
And emotionally, it must be like, yeah, I can't imagine what it's like to be a refugee. And then I can't imagine what it's like to be a refugee who's depending on handouts in order to survive. But to be a refugee, but to know that, hey, I'm going to be able to kind of do this on my own based on my own, good decisions, kind of in my prior life must be incredibly empowering.
Yeah.
I think that's so encouraging to hear these types of things as well, Daniel, because these positive stories, the positivity around, the positive environmental impacts of Bitcoin or the positive social impacts on Bitcoin are just absolutely so remarkable. And like you said, the news doesn't want to talk about these things. They're not as, I guess, they're not as catchy. I mean, they're certainly encouraging and enlightening and empowering. And
from time to time, they do. From time to time, you get a human interest story on one of these things. So to their credit, occasionally, because otherwise I wouldn't have found out about that guy in Ukraine. But you're right. It's not as good a headline as some of the other ones we've heard.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it is encouraging. Do you see Bitcoin use happening in Costa Rica?
Oh, a lot. And again, every country, there'll be different reasons for using it. And in the early days in Costa Rica, the big use case was businesses that were receiving a lot of their customers were in the States. They had no way to get money into the country without really large remittance fees. And there was one group of family business who said, yeah, we actually looked into it in 2012. Not because of the number go up, but as a solution to not having to pay massive remittance fees, like 20% of all revenue. And I mean, that can be half your profit just gone in remittances. So for them, they said it was a game changer for them. And then we've got Uvita, which is Bitcoin Jungle, which Francis, who's a Canadian from Ball Bitcoin, set up, came down to Uvita, and he's with a couple of other people done an incredible job. They've got hundreds of merchants and a population of a little over 7,000 who are adopting Bitcoin. I've visited there, and you can transact. You can use it as a medium of exchange. You can buy your gelato. You can buy falafels there. You can buy pretty much anything you want with Bitcoin, which is fantastic. And then there's Bitcoin mining happening as well. And again, it happens depending on the environment you're in. So in Costa Rica, of course, we have a lot of hydro, but a lot of micro hydro, because there's a lot of rivers that are on people's properties. And there's a guy called Eduardo who built a micro hydro station on his property many years ago, was selling the power to the grid. But during COVID, he lost the state-owned utility as a customer. Of course, demand went down, so they basically overnight said, we don't need your power anymore. And he went from having this cash cow to having a white elephant overnight, and to the point where he was about to lose his property, which had been in the family for 5 generations because of the debt burden with no revenue coming in. And it was Bitcoin mining that saved him. His son-in-law said, well, you couldn't do Bitcoin mining. He looked into it, tested it out, got a single ASIC up there, got some sats, did some calculations, said, wow, we get 400 of these things. We're going to be doing even better than we were selling power to the grid. I think the hash price has gone down a little bit since then, so it's not quite so lucrative, but still it's a lot better than having stranded power and no revenue coming in. So it basically saved his property.
That's pretty cool. I mean, those kind of stories are just so encouraging. So, Daniel, this has been great. Any thoughts you want to leave us with before we wrap things up here?
You know, I was at the Bitcoin conference recently, and we did a fireside chat, John Perkins and I, who's the author of Confessions of an Economic Hitman. And he wrote a lot about the World Bank and the IMF and how a lot of the policies have been basically resulted in a lot of extraction of wealth from the developing world to the West in many, many ways. And he knew very little about Bitcoin, and I knew very little about the IMF. And together we educated each other, and we found together that actually Bitcoin provided a lot of answers to the very problems that he had seen firsthand. Because suddenly you have a technology where, for example, Bhutan, they've got over $1 billion now in their strategic reserve through doing Bitcoin mining. And so it's lessened their reliance on IMF loans, World Bank loans. When you're using it for remittances, again, because that money is going into the country, more money is coming into the country. And what does that mean? It means that you don't have to hold the same cash reserves in the central bank. And what does that mean? It means you don't have to have a World Bank or IMF loan to hold those cash reserves. The more we look into it, the more we just find that it solves not just small problems, but actually quite major problems. But a lot of them are not ones that we see every day in the West. And so it's just a constant reminder that the more you look beyond your own horizons, you see a whole lot of problems that may not afflict you directly, but Bitcoin's solving, and it flips a lot of things. It was accessible to retail investors before institutional, and it's been valuable as a technology to the developing world before the developed. So that's just great. Because it appears like something, it can be something very different. It's a very counterintuitive technology. It looks like it's bad for the environment. Turns out it's great.
It's like the opposite of everything you think about, actually.
It really is, yeah.
That's great. Daniel, I really appreciate you spending time with me here today. I think this has been a super positive and enlightening conversation. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you, Jared. I appreciate it.